This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Pluto Press, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Ghassan Kanafani, Selected Political Writings. Endorsed by Mohammed El-Kurd and Ilan Pappé, this is a powerful collection by the charismatic Palestinian novelist who was assassinated in 1972 by the Israeli secret police. As a militant intellectual, Kanafani's understanding of the anti-colonial struggle remains vitally important. His revolutionary zeal and unique ability to humanize the Palestinian condition has made him a lasting icon for Palestinians and their allies across the world. Through this collection, you can discover insights into the history of Palestinian Marxist thought, liberation strategy, and read new reflections on Kanafani by contemporary activist academics. Dig listeners can get 50% off their first order of this or any book from Pluto Press using the code DIG50, that's DIG50, at plutobooks.com. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Today, I am interviewing tenant organizers Leonardo Vilchis and Tracy Rosenthal, the authors of the book Abolish Rent: How Tenants Can End the Housing Crisis. From the American settler colony expanding westward, violently expropriating indigenous land, through the federal subsidization of segregated mass post-war suburbanization, to the neoliberal turn to asset inflation as the engine of economic growth, land ownership, and then specifically homeownership, have been some of the fundamental axes around which full American social and economic citizenship have revolved. The expansionist, contradiction-resolving frontier that Greg Grandin describes in his amazing book, The End of the Myth, or what Matt Chrisman calls free real estate. The post-war system of mass homeownership conscripted substantial upper layers of the working class into a property owner democracy while structurally excluding the poor. Today, however, the housing crisis has become a generalized one, drawing in new layers of the working and middle classes into various degrees and forms of precarity, all while the poorest fall into the expanding ranks of homelessness and slum rentals. The American housing system has always played a key role in segmenting the working class between homeowners and tenants. Just as Stuart Hall once said that race is a modality in which classes lived, you could say that rent is a modality in which classes lived. The generalization of the housing crisis has now precipitated a set of contradictions that are fundamental to the entire American system. It's also, though, an opportunity to build powerful movements atop new solidarities. Abolish Rent surveys this history and much more, developing an account of rent as a social relation, detailing the genius of immigrant working-class tenants who are building fighting organizations to reclaim the city of Los Angeles, and tracing an account of where this nascent movement of renters and their organizations in the country might be heading. A bunch of tenant unions across North America are holding reading groups. Get in touch with the guests if you'd like to be involved. Before we get started, instead of asking you to support the podcast on Patreon this week, I'm taking advantage of my prerogative as the host of the show to tell you about Reclaim Rhode Island and to ask you to support our work, if you can afford to dig real deep to support us big time. Reclaim RI is a housing justice and tenant organizing group. Really, it's a group that's dedicated to having a plan to build and win organized, working-class, left popular power. And it's essentially my other full-time job. When I say I'm recording from Providence, Rhode Island, what I'm doing in Providence, Rhode Island a lot of the time is helping to build Reclaim Rhode Island. Unlike The Dig, however, I do my Reclaim work as a volunteer leader. I helped found Reclaim in the wake of the 2020 Bernie campaign. It was initially a general issue left progressive organization. Over the past 2 years, we've become a powerful tenant organizing and housing justice group. We've already won a lot of elections and a lot of tenant rights protections, a lot of wins against some nasty slumlords. And we're currently moving a proposal forward for a statewide public developer of housing. It's really moving forward. It's going to happen. Currently, we're in the process of attempting to rapidly scale up and build a statewide tenants union with hundreds and then thousands of members. To do that, we need to double our annual budget and double our staff from 2 to 4. Please contribute what you can, and please commit to a 3-year annual contribution if you can. There's a link to our Act Blue in the show notes. Please click it and make a donation. It's so clear since November that the Democratic Party, to put it very mildly, does not have a politics that can meet the moment and address the deep crisis of neoliberalism and the related rise of the MAGA far right. It was also rather clear before November, but our project in Rhode Island is to use this smallest, deepest blue state as a laboratory for reorganizing working class society at the fundamental tectonic level, and then remaking politics from the bottom up, from city councils through the state legislature, and ultimately up to our rather crappy congressional delegation. In short, what we have is a plan not just to win tenant and housing struggles, but also a plan to win for left power across the board. We want to make Rhode Island a laboratory for a model that can be scaled up nationally, and we really need your support to make it a reality. For me, my work on the Dig and at Reclaim Rhode Island, it's one big political project. It is what I do with my life. Everything I learn from actually doing politics profoundly shapes the analysis you hear on this podcast. And everything I learned doing this podcast plays a huge role in shaping my organizing work. Anyhow, please contribute what you can. And if you are interested in a major donation, $1,000, $10,000, $50,000, and I do hope some of you are, please reach out to me by email and we can set up a Zoom meeting to discuss. My email is daniel.denver@gmail.com. So if you're considering a major donation, send me an email, we'll set up a meeting, and we can discuss at greater depth our plan to win. But even if you can only afford a more modest annual donation, that's great too. If everyone listening right now donated $5 right now, we would hit our entire fundraising total right away. 20 people making $10,000 contributions would do the trick too. Okay, thanks. And here's Tracy and Leonardo. Tracy Rosenthal is a co-founder of the LA Tenants Union and a frequent contributor to the New Republic. They are now on rent strike in New York City. Leonardo Vilchis has been organizing tenants in Boyle Heights for more than 30 years. Trained in liberation theology, he co-founded Unión de Vecinos in 1996 and the LA Tenants Union in 2015. He and Tracy are the co-authors of Abolish Rent, out now from Haymarket. Tracy Rosenthal and Leonardo Vilchis, welcome to The Dig. And Tracy, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
We should start by talking about Los Angeles, where the already existing crisis for tenants is currently taking on truly dire proportions amid these rampant, brutally destructive climate change-fueled fires. What does the situation look like on the ground right now, Leo? Because you are in LA right now. How has the landlord and real estate industry dominated status quo in the city, county, state, and country, how has it all contributed to the current disaster? And then how have these years of tenant and other forms of organizing helped prepare the people and tenants of LA to respond?
Well, I'm going to start with the second part of your question. And I think it's very, very important, right? Because the crisis for us doesn't start, especially for our local, the Unión de Vecinos East Side local, doesn't start in the recent years, doesn't start in 2008. The crisis for us starts in 1996 when the federal government decides to destroy public housing. And at that moment, when we started our struggle, 1,200 families were pushed out of their projects and moved into the so-called affordable housing world, where they didn't qualify. And from then on, we move on to 2008 as the housing crisis comes, where tenants have to compete with former homeowners, and so on and so forth. So we have a really like a snowballing effect of displacement, eviction, and threats against low-income families and tenants who live in the city. But at the same time, during that process, we've grown from a small community resisting a displacement of public housing to a citywide LA Tenants Union that is located in 13 parts of the city with a network, a national network, the Autonomous Tenants Union network, that is also pushing other parts of the country. So our ability to respond to the crisis, our ability to organize, has helped us be ready for each one of these oncoming crises that happened in 2008 with the pandemic, and now more recently with the fires. There is a base, a constituency, an experience that tells us we cannot run away from our problem. We have to push back. And that's a great example for us is in the pandemic when tenants who couldn't pay the rent decided to, rather than run away scared and say, oh, we cannot pay the rent, we need assistance, to say, fuck it, I'd rather pay for food than to pay for rent. And we launched our campaign to as the food, not rent. So here in Los Angeles right now at this moment, there's different kinds of answers that are happening. We know that landlords are going to push people away. We know that racism is also going to sharpen the contradictions. But we have developed the network, the conditions from which we can, again, deepen our demand against evictions, to call for a freezing of evictions, to demand for rent control for all. And again, to call attention to what I would say is the sharper contradiction. As tenants, we have our fight. We learn to fight, to push back against illegal evictions. We learn to push back against abusive landlords. We learn to develop our local committees to fight back. But the sharper contradiction is going to be on the homeless. We're talking about the erasure of the struggle of the homeless, right? Because right now, everybody's going to be worried about the poor people who live in rich communities whose houses have been burned. And that's the discourse is going to be all over that. The Democrats who are trying to survive are going to pay attention to that. So the historic condition of homelessness, the growing snowballing condition of homelessness is gonna become more, it's gonna be erased in a way. So our locals, there are several of us that we're beginning to develop relationships, tighter relationships with the homeless community. We're talking about developing a connection, a deeper connection with the tenants and the unhoused to fight back. I mean, to be honest, one of the contradictions that exists between tenants and a house is that tenants don't like the homeless around their neighborhoods, right? So we're fighting against that. There's another sector of our community that is pushing for county freezing of evictions and new policies. So at the social level, we're building our network. At the political level, we're beginning to pull the levers of power and pushing and lobbying our council members to push back. And at the ideological level, we're making sure that people understand that this is not something new. This is part of a snowballing process. And in the richest state in California and under the Democrats, this is no longer a question of Democrats versus Republicans. This is a question of the state in capitalism and its ability to house the poor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think, obviously Leo named people in Los Angeles who are or who have already suffered the loss of a home, right? There are 75,000 people in LA County who live outside, who suffered the worst air of the crisis. And there's also the secondary victims that will start to see and are already starting to see, which is the thousands of tenants who just lost their jobs, right? Who work in these communities that have been destroyed as domestic workers, as gardeners, in service jobs. And that loss of work will obviously threaten their ability to pay the rent and put a roof over their head, right? So thinking about organizing for these two constituencies in this moment where, more people are paying attention to the crisis of housing because of these fires. One thing that I've been really thinking about is like watching the real estate developer from Selling Sunset decry price gouging. And it was a member of the Los Angeles Tenant Union, Chelsea Kirk, who started organizing a community-driven list of landlords who are charging sometimes, 100 times what an apartment has been listed for, right? And the apartment association is taking out a full-page ad in the LA Times to basically instruct their members that price gouging is wrong. And part of what they're doing, right, is reputation management. And in this moment, we talk a lot about how a crisis is what we call something that has always been true for the poor and working class, spreading to the middle and upper middle class. And we're seeing a crisis response from real estate developers, and the apartment association themselves has been like really ironic is a small way to put it, right? But I think that, when we look at, why is it that regulations against price gouging are possible in this moment against the man-made disaster of climate change, but not against the man-made disaster of our housing system, right? And so I think that emergencies really show us the powers of the state that are possible and we can use them, but also who is waiting in the wings to capitalize on the crisis that we have. And so these moments show us like who is prepared, right? It was the mutual aid networks that have been collecting masks that the state abandoned, that have been organizing to distribute survival gear to unhoused people that were ready to meet the moment. It was the tenant unions who have been doing food distribution for all of these years. And so just looking at the structures that we already have and how we can expand them, who is already prepared.
Zooming out from Los Angeles and from the present moment, how has this housing crisis, a term I know that you both critique in the book, how have these years of skyrocketing rents and accelerating displacement led to the reemergence of tenant organizing nationally in the powerful way that we've seen? And what role then did the pandemic eviction moratorium and rent relief play? Is it this combination, this contradictory combination of increased pressure on tenants with high rents, with this brief experience of social democratic policy so rare in the United States of rent relief and the eviction moratorium, in the midst of a revival of an American left that we might date back to Occupy? Is that what led us to today's upsurge in tenant organizing?
This problem has existed for a long, long time. And we have to look at it within the larger global perspective. Is also, we need to look at the changes in capitalism. The United States has become deindustrialized. Production, labor, and all these things are no longer as strong as it could be. And as people are being pushed into their homes to be the place of labor and the place of work and production, this is the place where the struggle is changing. So I think this shift in the conditions of labor and the modes of production is shifting the place of the struggle. And a lot of our Marxist friends are going to be really pissed off at me, and even sometimes in the debate, Tracy and I. But I just think if people are leaving the place of work, if the service sector is what's growing, and all these things are reshifting geographically, we need to think of a different place where the work is. I don't know how many people have gone into the gig economy. We're talking about millions of people. Where the conditions of struggle and oppression are happening is becoming more visible in our own communities where we live, that we've built to live in the neighborhoods that we built. And I would imagine that Tracy will have a deeper explanation of this stuff, but those conditions change the place of struggle. We have to, as Marxists, have to rethink who is labor, where is labor located, where is the concentration, and what are we going to about this new development of labor in the United States.
And relatedly, just the entire reorientation of the American economy around asset appreciation.
Yep. Mm-hmm. We're always organized by our own immiseration first, right? And so I think that just to say that, the state of the American housing system, where it takes 4 full-time minimum wage jobs to afford the average 2-bedroom apartment, where landlords file 7 evictions a minute, where there are a record 650,000 unhoused people across the country, the scale of the crisis that is now, it is the crisis, not homeownership, that is being democratized at this moment in American history. And I think that those contradictions, are really emerged, right? The former landlord, Mayor Eric Garcetti, said something that I always come back to, which is, in a good economy, homelessness goes up, right? And so the pride of place that asset inflation has had in our economy is failing, right? And we see that in rents going up, we see that in homeownership rates declining, and to put it in the broader context of the return of Gilded Age inequality, that it makes sense that the strategies that emerged from tenant unions in that time would come back. I think that something to say about the pandemic and our relationship to that, right? Like I think about one of the struggles that we write about is the Second Street Tenants Association. And I was really struck by something that one of the organizers articulated, which was when people were considering, like what it would mean to withhold their rent, one of the things that they talked about amongst each other was like, well, we could give our money to our landlord, but if we do that in this context where we don't know what's going to happen, that money just disappears, right? What is going to happen next month? Will we ever get our jobs back? Will we have the resources to pay for food? And the LA Tenant Union organized what I understand is the first rent strike during the pandemic on April 1st, 2020, under the banner of Food Not Rent. And what this tenants association, described is they were saying, like it seems like a risk to withhold our rent, but actually not doing that is a huge risk, right? Like not withholding our resources such that we can take care of each other and take care of ourselves. Like that is actually the bigger risk. And so I think that one of the things that comes into the book, and I think one of the reasons why we're seeing a resurgence of organizing, is because we're realizing that not doing anything about the state of this housing system, that in it of itself is a risk. Like accepting exponentially increasing rents, accepting displacement from our communities, accepting mass homelessness, right? That in and of itself is a risk. And I think that as we reckon with those contradictions, I think that people are more and more willing to take ownership of the tools that they have to take risks that are actually, in some ways, bids for more safety in this system.
I want to build up on that a little bit, if it's possible. One of the things that we've confronted when we started doing a lot of this organizing, in talking with the organizers, was the whole question around fear, right? There was all this question of, tenants are afraid of doing this thing. But one of the things that we talk about in other moments and spaces, and I think in the book too, is the whole question of fear. In the fear, there's a judgment of the landlord, right? The tenants who are afraid of losing their home are also pissed off with the landlord because they have to pay this more rent, and also resentful. So there is this anger, and at the same time, this dream. The reason why we're paying the rent is to have a better life. So I come from the liberation theology movement, and when we talk about a crisis, we're also talking it's a moment of judgment, a moment of decision. And this was a moment where tenants and everyone who lives under the conditions described by Tracy, they had to make a decision about what is the relationship with the landlord. And people shifted the relationship. And the organizing of tenants, the building of tenants union, allow for the changing in the mindset of saying, we're going to move from fear to push back and to energize our anger against the landlords. So the crisis itself liberated people from their fear and moved into a place where they had to respond. And I think that's also something that has happened in this process.
Do you think that the brief but relatively powerful protections afforded by the emergency context of the pandemic, do you think that had an effect on what people suddenly saw to be possible?
Yeah, but I mean, these are a consequence of our own fight. I mean, when the tenants go out and say, in the city of LA, when the tenants go and say food not rent, that was a crisis I would say in the model of the United States, where everybody has a home and all that stuff. All these unhappy tenants across the country, that was going to be a problem. In Los Angeles, it was very, very clear. The city of Los Angeles, they just didn't know what they were going to do with all these tenants all of a sudden at unison saying, we're not going to do stuff. So they got the benefits. And of course, yes, that encouraged the tenants to say, yeah, we can do this thing and we can expand on that.
Yeah, I think also, right, one of the things that we reckoned with during the pandemic is the actual extent of the powers of the state to requisition property, to seize the hotels, to prevent people from being evicted from their homes, to give tenants resources. All of those powers are on the table all the time. It's just only in these moments of emergency where they emerge. I mean, we should be really clear, right, that the state is not just one thing and it is contradictory. And that's something that we also learned over the course of the rollout of pandemic protections, right? Like, there was an arm of the state that issued an eviction moratorium, and that institution was the CDC, right? And that does tell us that from the perspective of public health, that we should maybe treat housing differently than we do. But then what occurred, right? Another arm of the state, the judiciary, moved in to squash that, and the legislature produced something else, which were in many ways subsidies to landlords that tenants had the burden of having to apply for. So I think that what we got was a demonstration of like our capacity as tenants to organize within our buildings, in our communities, to grow as a movement, and then also to see the dynamic of this state that's captured by real estate interests that was more invested in the propping up of landlord profits than it was in preventing the spread of COVID or protecting tenants. And so I think that both of those things were really radicalizing for the tenant movement. The process of organizing to keep each other safe, and then the process of being disorganized by the state's pandemic response.
Right. It's a really good point about the way that the state operates under capitalism. Obviously, the state has a very important role in terms of reproducing the political and social conditions for the reproduction of capitalist relations, but not in the neat way that pithy Marx line, the executive committee of the bourgeoisie, might have people believe, in my opinion. It's a far more contradictory site of struggle than that. The state, depending on the balance of forces, can prohibit rent control or it can enact rent control. It can destroy public housing, as you were saying earlier, Leo, with Hope 6 under Bill Clinton, or it can build more public housing and socialize the housing system. The housing system that emerged from the New Deal order, which we're still living in so many ways today, though with lots of changes, particularly since the rise of the asset boom economy alongside the neoliberal turn. But that order facilitated a mass incorporation of Americans into homeownership, including, very importantly, substantial upper segments of the working class, particularly the white working class. This alongside the permanent exclusion from homeownership for the poorest working class people. With this present crisis, that's changed in a variety of ways. We have downwardly mobile college-educated people who, in a prior era, would have rented during their youth before buying a home later in life. Many people in this demographic have also now been permanently excluded. And I would argue that it's that exclusion that makes this the generalized housing crisis that it's become. What does it mean that this crisis has created this cross-class composition of tenants? Or to put it another way, how do you think about the relationship between the permanent, long-standing structural crisis and then this more acute and recent crisis that's emerged?
I think that we could say, right, like the two authors of this book are like reflect those constituencies that you named, right? Like millennials, and like we've got like one millennial and one
senior citizen.
Well, immigrant, and I was going to say immigrant from Mexico, but that too. And I think that it's, as you say, right, the millennials are the first generation to be shut out of homeownership and are living in this new era of property that is transferred through generational wealth and finding themselves in community in the same place with immigrants and people of color who have long been shut out of the American property regime. And I mean, I think that is one of the reasons why this, like, why we wanted to do this collaboration. And I think, and I should say, right, that even within that, like, when we think about who we find in our movements, right, like, we often even find like I would say we find like the abuelas and the LGBTs, because the home is a historical domain of women, and because we might find people who have an alternative relationship to the idea of social reproduction. But I know that's like, maybe that's one step too far, right? But I think that, what finding ourselves together means, right? It's contingent, right? That it provides opportunities for solidarity, and it also provides opportunities for co-optation. And part of what this project is about, and, like, why we are thinking about organizing through the specific form of a union, is because we are trying to look for that form that might animate, self-interest and solidarity. One of the interventions that we are really intent on making in the book and in our work is about thinking with and organizing alongside unhoused people as tenants. And there are many ways of orienting our politics. I am haunted by the president of Mexico articulating, for the good of all, the poor first, right? Could you imagine? And could you imagine a politician articulating that here, right? But there's also, we have a tradition of like Black feminism articulating that politics as well, like from the margins to the middle. And I think that, when we think about what a union does, is that it is an infrastructure that can put those things together, like our self-interest and our solidarity. And we also talk about the union as a school and a place for political education. And so I think that I think that part of our role in building this movement is about orienting ourselves around the most vulnerable tenants.
Yeah, in terms of my practical things and my own experience, to be precise, my community organizing begins in the church with the Jesuits, and in the context of Central America Solidarity Movement, where liberation theology is very, very important, very, very key. And at the core of that is the notion of the preferential option for the poor, which means you center your work, your everything with the preferential option for the poor, and from that place you do the transformation of society. So that's part one. Part two is in our own organizing, as we move out of the housing projects. The housing movement was mostly a movement that was supporting working class tenants, mostly immigrant, and that was selling them on the idea of affordable housing as a solution to the problem. And as is obvious in the book and in many experiences, affordable housing is not affordable to the most poor. So there was no preferential option for the poor there in any way. There was just gaslighting of the poor, basically, for policies that were neoliberal. This crisis, which again is about deciding, about people taking sides, about judgment of the structure of society, forced a lot of people in the community, white professionals, college-educated people, to take a side on this stuff, on the side of a system that was not solving the problems for them, or the side of the poor who were already organizing. And to me, that's very, very key, because in the Tenants Union in Los Angeles, we got an influx of people who were committed, who were interested, who were politically savvy, who had an education, who were in the middle of a crisis, and they had to take side with people who were already organized, but not infested or infected by the ideologies of the neoliberal state that says, foundations and nonprofit organizations are going to solve the problem through neoliberal policies. These were people who had a critique, and they were looking for new ways of doing this stuff. And that's really what helped to shape the LA Tenants Union. People who were not infected by the old ideology of the NGOs and the nonprofit industrial sector that produces neoliberal policies. So I think it's also very important to understand at a practical level. So when people started launching themselves to fight all these different campaigns, there were lawyers and nonprofits and community organizations that called themselves tenant organizations were saying, "Oh, you cannot do that." And these organizers and these activists saying, "Oh, yes, we can." And they started doing it. And then said in Los Angeles, that sent the city into a crisis, because there were these rowdy, crazy people working across class and gender and race, saying, "We can do this stuff." That's an example of what helped us launch the Food Not Rent campaign. Everybody was ready to say that. Nobody was saying, "Oh, no, we need to protect the tenants. Oh, no, this is bad for our mission. Oh, no, the foundations don't like that." And I come from an experience of being nonprofits where people were telling us, don't talk about gentrification, don't criticize affordable housing. It was very lonely out there when we were saying we need to criticize those two things. The moment the tenants union emerges and all these people join the movement, we're like, wow, now we can do whatever we want. And I think at a very practical organizing level, this was fantastic. And it's great to have these people.
How does the tenant movement confront the place and really the problem of homeownership in American political economy and also very much society more generally? It's hard to overstate how powerful this is as a materially grounded social and political force, an aspiration and identification of property ownership as the basis for really full social citizenship, and also familial order, well-being, security, normalcy. I mean, there's so much at play here, and it ends up playing a key role in segmenting the working class between homeowners and tenants. Homeownership is in so many ways at the bedrock of American common sense, of our collective structure of feeling, whether it's someone who feels trapped as a renter in a shitty unit and thus aspiring to homeownership, or someone already materially committed to homeownership as a current homeowner. This is this material attachment that cultivates an individualist, reactionary, anti-communitarian subjectivity, encouraging wage laborers to identify instead as property owners who are more concerned with rising asset prices than stagnating or declining real wages, a politics that in California powered the late 70s tax revolt, which itself paved the way for Reaganism nationally. Of course, suburbanization as a project that made homeownership the majority American experience, which in turn incentivized popular support for race and class segregation, and alongside that, very, very importantly, the fiscal segregation between wealthy and poor municipalities. All of this, at this current moment, presents us with a seemingly zero-sum situation where homeowners, even working class ones, benefit from rising house prices, while tenants would, of course, benefit from them declining. How do you think through these profound problems of homeownership in this country as homeownership undermines solidarities, rewires interests, and in the face of all that, how can the tenant movement navigate this terrain? And one last thing, I mean, ideologically, it's really grounded in homeownership, but extends beyond it. It's this moment of countless shady influencers encouraging people to trace the dream of passive income, either through real estate or crypto or becoming an influencer or whatever, anything to exit the hell of today's wage labor market and rental market. How do you think about encountering and fighting this on the social, cultural, economic, political front?
Well, for starters, as you were asking the question, one of the things that I was going back to what I was saying is the notion of the poor organizing themselves is very key in this process. And for me, the professional of the poor is very, very key in this process. The non-profit industrial sector and foundations and the relationship with political parties like the Democrats continue to promote this vision of the community of what's possible, right? Everybody can become a homeowner. Everybody should become a homeowner. Our movement in Los Angeles kind of broke away from it because they saw the failure of it. So first of all, in the long run, this promise, this desire is decaying. At the same time as you're describing, there's a class distinction that now is being sharpened, right, between those who are owners and are able to buy their homes and those who cannot. This is something that I don't think that in the United States used to exist before, where this ideologically, physically, people could think in those terms. I came from Mexico, where these distinctions are everywhere. You can see the poor everywhere, the separation everywhere, and people understand that. You see that in other countries in America. The United States is beginning to see the poor every day. It used to be a time when that wasn't visible. Now you see them everywhere. And also you see people falling into poverty every day. The middle class is falling into poverty every day. So for me, there is a situation where the American dream is falling apart in a different way from what is happening in other times. In other times, the state was able to respond and create new responses. In Los Angeles, and that's the place that I speak from because that's where I live most of the time. In Los Angeles, affordable housing is no longer a solution. Loans for people to buy a home are no longer a solution. We're surrounded by people who would like to buy their homes, and even amongst the organizers, the professional organizers within the tenants union, and it's no longer a solution. So it's a time to decide for people where to go. And the organizing of the poor outside of that system is helping in visualizing that. Now, it's an uphill battle. And in this uphill battle, the importance of building the tenants union, the enforcement of commitment, the importance of building a militancy. Remember that the tenants union, all of us are volunteers. So there has to be something there for all an organization that is built, all the volunteers, full of hope. And of course, in the long run, we have to figure out how we're going to support ourselves financially. So there's a sense of hope that comes out of the struggles that we've been developing over time. There's a sense of hope that comes out of the results that we have achieved as we have in these fights. There's a sense of hope that emerges out of the growing of strategies and tactics and impacts that we're having. There's a sense of hope that emerges out of the creation of all these other locals and tenant unions in other parts of the country. So hope is very, very important, and hope against the negativity of that. So that's one thing that I think is very, very key. At the political level, we have to have victories, and we have to change those conditions. And one of the biggest problems that I think we have in the United States is the question of housing. When we narrow things around the question of housing, we're missing the whole question about development and the struggle for land. When you don't control the territory, when you don't control the land, you have no control of what's been built in that land in those places. Latin America, and there's many countries across the world that have policies and politics around land redistribution. The United States used to have a moment where there was land redistribution. And land redistribution means paying attention to the social use of the land, how land and its use is serving the needs of people in our community. We need to elevate those demands and move away from this whole notion of, we just want to house everybody, and move back to a point where we want to make sure that everyone has a place, everyone has a location. And that's an ideological struggle that we have to develop within the tenants union. These are like very, very far away things. These are just seeds of something that we have to build. But if we don't change the mentality of people around land development, land control, to just having your home, it's going to be very difficult. And to me, that's a question of how do we internationalize the struggle? How do we internationalize the struggle? How do we connect ourselves to international movements, national movements that are saying we need to have a land redistribution, a reorganization of who controls the land, how that's controlled. How are we going to do that? I don't know, in the world of financialization, in this moment in time and all stuff. But that's the ideological struggle that we have to have. Look beyond just having a home to controlling the land. The fight against gentrification in our neighborhood has helped us understand that. And I think we need to grow in that sense. I'm very vague on this one because it's, as I said, this has the seed of this stuff is hope. Do we hope that we can create a different country with different relationships of ownership, with different social relationships, and a different understanding of what does it mean to have a place? Hopefully, the struggle in Palestine helps us understand that. Whole neighborhoods understanding that they're building a place where they live, that they're building relationships where they live, that they're building history where they live, and whole communities saying, we want to stay here because we believe in what we build together. So it's no longer about home, it's about the neighborhood. It's no longer about the neighborhood, it's about the history that we built together. The tenants union as a locality can make that happen. But we have to build the ideology and the identity and the thinking that makes us go there. So it's towards the future, not in the present.
Yeah, I think you're asking one of the hardest questions to answer, right? Which is that tenancy does not neatly map onto class. And because of the unique and deep role of homeownership in the ideology of this country that basically, shapes tenants as temporarily embarrassed homeowners. We can think about this all the way, as Leo did, in thinking about how settlement and the conferring of property rights was made through conquest, and that, the original ownership in this country aligned citizenship, the formation of the US state, and property ownership. And that is ingrained also in our system of democracy, which was shaped around protecting the interest of the propertied from the propertyless. And the way that we see that repeat in the supposedly democratic structures that we have now, whether that's like enormous districts such that like people don't have democratic control over the places they live and are outweighed by landowners. I think that also to talk about homeowners, the ideology of homeownership in this country is also to specifically then talk about the history of the Red Scare, that one of the central techniques of recruiting people into the interests with elites was through the purposeful project of homeownership as a way of defending against communism. And the project of homeownership, the democratization of homeownership, was articulated in specifically those terms. The defeat of public housing was articulated in specifically those terms. We have a housing system that is the sedimentation of colonial conquest, the Red Scare, and, as Leo was saying, like now is being articulated through financialization. But I think that at the same time, there are ways that we have in the movement tried to articulate a class interest even as we negotiate across homeowners and tenants, right? Like I know some people in the movement refer to bank tenants. And this is a way of describing the relationship that actually many homeowners have over their homes, that even when they're gaining the ideological benefits of ownership, what they have is a relation, like who owns their home is a bank. And yes, the New Deal order granted them the standard 30-year mortgage, which is basically the equivalent of rent control. However, we have seen in the case of 2008 and, historically, we've seen homeownership only extended through predatory terms, right? So whether that's contract sales, subprime mortgages, like we've seen that relationship is actually less stable than we think. And I think that trying to include bank tenants in our movement has been one way of articulating that solidarity. Like the central contradiction is around the growth of property values. And that is the fundamental contradiction that we name in the book and that you just described, right? Is that what tenants need is a managed decline of property values. And this is like fundamentally against the project that homeowners have been recruited into, real estate speculators want our cities to be, right? Even the way that we can think about the ways that our cities resources are reliant on the growth of property values to then like grow their tax bases so that they can have services, right? I think that, and this is, I think, why tenant organizing is a real threat to the status quo of the housing system and of the American system more broadly.
Yes. The tenants movement, the quote-unquote tenants movement before the tenants union emerged, when people were getting evictions, most of the work of the lawyers was to negotiate people's exits. Basically saying, you lost your case. We're gonna negotiate 1 month for you to move on and do all this stuff. Now during the tenants movement, with the tenants organization, we really pushed the lawyers to negotiate for people to stay and to push back on the landlord. So even tenants themselves were going to say, I'm going to move out and find another place. Now that the resistance is no. We want to stay where we are. And the whole fight, the legal fight, the role that the attorney plays is slowing things down so the organizing allows for people to stay. So we had a system that negotiated people moving on because tenants don't have a right to stay wherever they are. They just have to move on if things get tough. So the lawyers and the nonprofit movement was doing this stuff. At some point in our history, the city of Los Angeles, after demolition of housing projects, came to Boyle Heights and said, we have new plans to help people develop programs to buy their homes. The members of the organization started saying, no, what we need is more money and more resources for rental housing. The city officials were so pissed off with the tenants because they didn't want home ownership programs and they only wanted rental assistance and rental programs because they said, no, the home ownership. So as tenants have organized, they've learned that, the whole issue of home ownership is just a myth. And then they push back. So the city was really, really pissed off. And actually, we're able to push away these programs of home ownership and we start pushing for more rental housing. Of course, what they brought was affordable housing. When the tenants started showing the affordable housing was destroying the homes of people and say, no, we don't want affordable housing. We want people to stay. So there is a layer now, people saying we have a right to stay wherever we are. The other struggle that had developed with the tenants union was the whole notion of cash for keys. Tenants were being pushed out of their homes by offering them money. And of course, the lawyers and nonprofits started like jumping in. Oh, we're going to negotiate this cash for keys so you get more money. The tenants union was saying, no, we want to stay. And the tenants decided to stay again, pushing again this whole notion that tenants don't have a place and pushing in favor of the whole notion that people have a right to stay in their own place. As renters, and I think it's very important to understand, renters want to stay where they're at. So that changes the condition of, oh, I'm going to move at some point to have a housing. And more recently, the anti-gentrification struggle in Boyle Heights, we were fighting, and in different parts of the city, actually, we were fighting against gentrification and resisting in Echo Park and all these different places. And it was so funny because when people were like, when the leaders of the community pushed and said, well, what are you going to do when these things have happened? Said, well, another crisis is going to come and people are not going to be able to buy homes and we're going to be able to stay. So the whole mentality of creating a space where we can control and where people cannot invest is also important in terms of this condition, right? So fighting against gentrification is fighting against investment and fighting against this notion of development that supposedly is going to change the economy and all that stuff. So ideologically, that also changes how we look at property, how we look at ownership, how we look at development. The role of the tenants union is to push back against these ideas by putting at the center of the whole thing the right to stay, the right to build community, and the tenants learning to say no to everything that encourages, cajoles them, or pressures them into displacement to give up the right to place. And from then that will follow the idea of how do we develop our communities.
You just mentioned that the typical way that tenant lawyers or legal aid attorneys, how they work is to negotiate tenants' exit, and that you now have lawyers in LA who work to help people stay and to support organizing. How did you all make that happen? Because my sense is that this is a very real challenge in many places. A lot of these lawyers mean very, very well, but they are ground down by a legal system that is basically an constant eviction mill, just churning tenants through every day.
Well, I mean, I think it's that, but also it's ideology. And that's why I was going back to the whole notion, tenants don't have a right to a place. And people, that's just the way it is. And we've been able to change that. And lawyers are rethinking the whole conception. But everybody, wherever we went, people used to say, well, too bad, this is how it is, this is how the system works. And now we're coming to a place where the system is changing. But also as the union, our mission has been to crunch the lawyers into submission, to really, really to crunch the lawyers says, no, we're not going to accept the terms. We're not going to do this stuff because we have had so many struggles in which we have seen, the phrase that I use a lot is like, these people negotiate our defeat without a fight. And our point is to negotiate our defeat after a fight. We want to negotiate our defeat after we were defeated. But when you preemptively negotiate your defeat without a fight, you're screwed. And the lawyers are the ones who negotiate the defeat because once the lawyer comes in, everything gets lost. And we say, no, the lawyer works for us.
No, I think that, I feel like one of the ways that we reckon with the role of tenant lawyers is through, the role of other social service institutions and the way that tenants are, taught and in many ways directed to solve their problems, right? Which is as individuals. And I think that that's the fundamental distinction that I would say for engaging with lawyers as a movement, right? Is that when lawyers are set to solve a case, they often do so for tenants as individuals rather than like through the organizing process, right? And we have examples in our union of so many successful collaborations with lawyers to, in many ways, their strategy is to stall so that the organizing strategy can work, right? And this is what happened in the case of the mariachis who were on rent strike in a market rate building, right? So in many ways, there were very few legal protections that would keep them in their homes. And the legal strategy that was employed was one of stalling so that the organizing strategy of the rent strike, that economic sanction and the, social sanction of the direct actions that were taking place could put the pressure on the landlord, and ultimately did bring that landlord to the negotiating table. And then the lawyers helped serve to negotiate a collective bargaining agreement. And I think that, we see that example too in Hillside Via. One of the organizers of that struggle started organizing, went to law school, and is now defending those tenants, and his strategy is really to allow the organizing, which in this case, right, like these are tenants that are organizing in 3 languages across 3 tenancy regimes in the same building, an incredibly complex group to organize, right? But thinking about the legal strategy as a part and in support of the organizing strategy is, I think, essential, and I think that, this is the dynamic that we describe, when we talk about like rights, when we quote James Boggs, right? Rights are what you make and what you take. And I think that both of those struggles, right, in the case of the mariachis, like winning a collective bargaining agreement for that is the equivalent of rent control in a market rate place, right? Like that relied on having legal support, right? But it was the organizing strategy that won those rights. In the case of Hillside Via, their affordable housing covenant expired, but they have been on rent strike for years to demand that the state expropriate their building. And the reason why they are still there today, still fighting, is because of that organizing strategy with the support of their legal team.
Yeah, and I think also part of what follows from this stuff is also for about individualization, right? These are all lawyers working on their own as part of a larger legal aid agency, trying to deal with all those cases and having to do all this groundwork every day. But now, on the other side, there is an organization that supplements a lot of the work that they need to do. So I think at some point, yes, we're crunching, but at the same time, the tenant organization now is a more intelligent organization in terms of dealing with the case of the tenants, in the case of the struggle, right? Rather than just, as Tracy was saying, just having one individual in one building, to organize the whole building and create different conditions. So on the one side, the organization, the tenants union, is changing the conditions of the struggle, even for the legal field. And on the other side, now the lawyer itself has the support of this larger thing. The key thing is the change of thinking, right? Where the lawyer, rather than seeing himself or herself as the savior, sees himself or herself as integrated in a larger struggle. And that's a more of an individual thing that the lawyers have to decide, because the larger institutions are not ready. The Legal Aid Foundation of Los Angeles is not ready to work with the tenants union. A lot of the nonprofit legal organizations are not ready, but a lot of the lawyers are learning the benefits of working with organized tenants with a tenants union. And that's the thing that we need to change, which means then in the dialectics of this thing, legal aid agencies are going to have to change their own thinking, their own ideology, their own mission, their board of directors, and who gives them the funding, because they're not going to be able to survive if they stay in this situation.
But I think it's really important to think, and Leo and I talk a lot about this, like how do we have a union that respects a division of labor, but that division of labor is in the service of our larger goals. Having lawyers with the specialized skills of stalling in the courts such that the organizing strategies have time to work has been absolutely essential to us. But what distinguishes that is that those lawyers are part of the division of labor of our organizing, are part of our movement. They're part of the union.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it's important to look at the cracks that it's going to create in the system of services. And that's part of what's happening with the tenants union is opening cracks or opening contradictions that exist within the system of services. Tenant rights organizations, legal aid foundations that have to deal with housing. All of those people have to rethink how they're thinking. And that goes to your prior question about what are we dealing with? Well, we're dealing with a transformation, and hopefully strong tenants unions are able to force that change.
The history of neoliberalism, as we've touched on a few times, is also the history of a decades-long real estate boom that saw urban land going from being relatively cheap due to its use for industrial production to, amid deindustrialization, being rendered an asset that creates profits through endless and rapid appreciation. This, of course, no surprise, has dramatically increased the price of land and housing in cities all over the place, and it's remade who lives where, how different sorts of people can live and how power is wielded in cities. How is the tenant struggle over individual apartments and buildings, how is it linked to this broader fight over the commanding heights of power to remake what our cities look like, how and whether people can inhabit cities, what cities are for? And then specifically, what role does city and neighborhood level change, this broader displacement and remaking of places that accompanies gentrification? What role does that play in Latu's strategy and work? What does it mean for how we think about the right to collectively and democratically plan what our cities are and what they're for?
My experience, I have had the privilege of in our local of seeing the answer to this question, or the future of the potential for the answer to this question. We moved out of the housing projects. We wish there was a whole community of people working together to address the problem of gang violence, to address the problem of police violence, to address the immigration rates. So people in the housing projects who live next to each other were helping each other, assisting each other, and building community and building peace in their neighborhood. And it was the ability for them to come together in small communities that we wanted to protect when the demolition of the housing projects took place, right? Because basically, the federal government under Democrats was saying this community has no value, their interest has no value, their relationships have no value. Let's kill their housing and the community that they live in and send them away to live wherever they can. And that pretty much stuck with me. So whenever people move to other places, our goal was not, at the beginning was not to build tenants organization, was to build small communities wherever people lived. So we would come to these neighborhoods and say, okay, what are the issues that are happening in your house? What are the issues in your building? But also what's happening around your neighborhood? And we started building networks of neighborhood communities. So when the housing crisis emerges, we just then retreat back to the buildings, start organizing the buildings. And what tends to happen with tenant organizing is, once you solve the problem of the housing, people move on and do these things. But in our community, we ask, what else is going on outside of your building? And in that process, we've been able to build networks of neighborhood committees. So when you organize, the room or the apartment is in a building, the building is in a block, the block is in a neighborhood, and the neighborhood is part of a social network that we're trying to maintain and build. For us, that's a construction of a popular democracy. As people move together in these neighborhoods, as people work together to clean up the alleys, to have better stoplights, to protect the pedestrians, to develop relationships with the gang members and then manage those relationships to the violence, they're building a social, political, democratic structure that in the long run makes you a different kind of citizen. So we're no longer citizens that just wait every 4 years to elect our representatives. We're citizens that first try to solve their own problems. Second, we organize others to change priorities or to make decisions about their community. And when gentrification comes, we're ready to fight for it. And that's what has happened in Boyle Heights. Right next to the housing projects, to whatever was left of the housing projects, our council member wanted to build an arts district. And the women that live in the housing projects said no. When this arts district comes, the housing authority is going to sell our homes, our rents are going to go up, and we're going to be displaced. So we said no to the arts district. And he was very interested because our crazy tenants local was the only one who was saying no to our district. Everybody was saying, oh, negotiate with them, get some benefits, get some programs. And the women said, fuck no, we don't want arts districts here. We don't want galleries, we don't want anything. And we spent a couple of years fighting against that, and we pushed all the galleries out. That couldn't have happened without the community that has been built over the last 20 years in our neighborhood. So I think the Tenants Union is a seed for popular democracy. It's a seed for neighborhood communities that organize themselves, that build democracy themselves, that set up their own priorities, and then make demands of the state or negotiate with the state as things develop. That's our goal. Our goal is not just to solve the problem, and we say that a lot. The subject of the Tenants Union is the tenant, not housing. And the tenant is a student, the tenant is a homemaker, the tenant is a worker, tenant is a labor, the tenant is everything. And the tenant lives in a place. So the whole idea is build territory, control the territory, defend the territory, build democracy in that territory, and change the politics of the city. If we repeat this across different cities, we'll change states. If we change states, we can change the country. But It's a long-term protracted mission. It's a revolutionary mission that starts with people becoming citizens of the places that they live in. And that we learned it from the South African movimiento, the South African movement, the people who are like shack dwellers, that they told us, you're a citizen of the place that you live in. And that's what we're trying to do, build citizenship in the places that we live in. Utopian, but revolutionary.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, like Leo is describing the two axes that tenants are organized around. One, we think of a tenant association as, just a unit of struggle against a particular landlord, right? But we also, we're organizing in a place. And so thinking about what is happening outside of our door in our neighborhoods is as much of the work for our union as the struggle against landlords. And so I think taking control of our neighborhoods is the positive force that we build to defend our homes from landlords and real estate speculators. Like all the time, I reflect on something that one of the mariachi tenants described, right? Which was about like how she committed to her rent strike. And, like she didn't remember signing some like solidarity pledge. She remembered that she was comfortable enough to borrow an onion from her neighbor, right? And so like a tenant union is really about politicizing and like even like weaponizing that politics of neighborliness that we build by getting to know each other, like by getting to know the people who are around us, building our own authority that takes place in our communities. Like I think that the East Side local chapter like has been always a really amazing example of this, right? Like not only in articulating a politics of refusal, but also in like getting the needs met for their community, right? And so like when we think about one intersection in Boyle Heights, which has a bench that the neighborhood committee put there that has a crosswalk that only exists because tenants organized to demand it. When we think about the street lights that only exist because the tenants organized to demand it, right? When we think about the networks of community safety that were developed in that community to deal with gang violence and police violence at the same time, right? We're thinking about the union as something that's not just about displacing the power of our landlords, but about claiming territory and allowing us to control the places we live. We define tenant as anyone who doesn't control their own housing. And so a tenant union is the vehicle that we have to claim that control. And that takes shape not just in terms of how much rent we pay, whether we have like busted appliances and mold in our ceilings. That's also like, do we have a crosswalk so we can get across the street safely? Like, is there a place to sit at the bus stop? Are our neighborhoods safe? And building those local infrastructures through our local chapters, through our union, is really the means we have to take that control. And I mean, maybe the last thing I'll say, right, is thinking about that dynamic, that dialectic that Leo described in our relationship to the state. When we think about gentrification, often what we're thinking about is the ways that investment is presented as community improvement, but actually what happens is that the community is removed, and that by taking control of our neighborhoods, like figuring out our own needs, redistributing our own resources, and then making demands of the state for resources when we can't solve the problems ourselves, that is how we can get our needs met as a community, and a way to think about relating to the state long term.
Yeah, and during the pandemic, all these different committees have become really important centers. Right now, when the fires happen, the first thing that we did was go to the different communities, and we distributed like 10,000 masks in less than 2 days, while the city council member was like in their office trying to do this distribution, asking people to come. We did the thing quicker than the people were able to do it. And at the same time, since the pandemic, we've been able to distribute thousands and thousands of bags of food for the community out of all these different communities. So these houses are becoming community centers in the block that organize the tenants and that help the tenants address their needs.
It's not just public space in neighborhoods, but also about the sort of communal space within buildings and projects, or the lack thereof. You write a lot about landlords retaliating against organizing tenants by shutting down a garden or some sort of collective space. But then there also seems to be all sorts of collective or communal spaces in apartment complexes that are just precluded from happening in the first place, not as retaliation, but almost as a matter of course. I'm thinking in particular about a large project-based Section 8 complex in Providence or outside of Providence with a ton of green space, and tenants basically aren't allowed to use it for anything at all. It's remarkable. What do these fights over communal collective space within projects, within apartment buildings, what are they about? Whether those fights be kind of explicitly political in the case of just naked retaliation, or never really formally politicized at all? Because you move in there and you just find out, oh, my kids can't really play outside. We can't grill in the yard. We can't do anything in the yard.
Well, I mean, from a perspective of mine as organizer in this process, that's something that we preemptively want to break away from. We want to destroy these things. And I think there's two parts of this thing. One of them is ideology, right? When people move into these apartments, or the ideology individualism, your home is your castle, your apartment is your castle. So what the tenants union is doing is trying to build relationships, build a network of relationships. And the places where those are developed are in these public spaces. So, of course, if there's a garden out there that is available, that is visible, that is tangible, of course, the first thing that we would want to do as a tenants union, as a local, is to be able to start creating events in those spaces and those places. And that's when it becomes political. But I think that's the kind of stuff that we want to start changing and breaking away from. And people take for granted these rules. These are invisible rules, cultural, hidden rules that we just accept. And our role is to break away from that. So that's also part of the ideological part of the work. Talking about your example, if we were going to work in that building, that would be the first thing that we want to do. If we want to have a building committee meeting, we say, okay, let's go to the yard, pull out some chairs, and let's see what happens. And they will take it from there. Historically, in our spaces, what we've been able to do is we've been able to grow in those spaces. And then in the larger political culture, people look ridiculous when they say, oh, we don't want the children to play in the garden. So we've been able to, because the larger politics says something different about that private space. And that's what the whole point is, to take the struggle inside the building outside common sense of what are green gardens for. Also integrating the building to the larger life of the community, integrating the life of the individual in their own apartment to the larger social network that exists and that is building something different.
Yeah, I feel like, I think you could also see this like in the development of the Los Angeles Tenant Union itself, right? Where we started with one single meeting in Hollywood and expected that people travel an hour and a half to get there, right? Soon realized, of course, that would have to go. And we started local chapters, right? Which themselves had central meetings. And then even that too has changed such that now in many ways what we do is organize in the common space of people's buildings and bring the union, right? To the site of people's homes, really making the site of people's homes the site of our political struggle. And I think that, that development, right, that into these common spaces then provides those beachheads for the community to meet. Those communal spaces form bases of power for our organizing is precisely because, there are ways that we use space that are outside of the plans of our landlords for us as individual tenants who will accept our living conditions and exist in our separate and segregated spaces. inhabiting those spaces has really been a way that the union becomes a part of the everyday life of a community.
Long time ago, I don't even remember how long ago, there was this book called Bowling Alone that was talking about how Americans are becoming more disconnected and more alone. And it's so funny because sometimes, stereotypically, when we're doing all this organizing, they say, oh, Latinos are like more gregarious and more social and all that stuff. And no, when you walk into the neighborhoods and people live in their little castle and their own thing, and the first thing they do is put their fence and stuff like that. The American ideology pushes us in this place of isolation and separation and loneliness. And our job has been always to crack at it, to really break that away, to build social networks, to establish the solidarity. And going back to the prior question, the whole notion of all these mostly white professionals, middle class and all stuff, that were used to just taking care of their own individual needs, finding themselves in these spaces, that's also changing how they see themselves. So the tenants union right now is working in an ideological battle that is looking for the construction of community. As the system tries to individuals, makes us individuals looking at our own phones and just living staring at our own phones, the tenants union is saying, stop looking at your phone, sit down in the middle of the garden, and let's talk about the housing and the neighborhood, and let's organize the next party next week that we want to have.
I'm Aziz Rana, and you're listening to The Dig, a great place for analysis about where we are, how we got here, and what can be done. It's my favorite podcast, and you can support it at patreon.com.
This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Dissent, a democratic socialist magazine of politics and culture. Dissent's winter issue, The End of the Biden Era, is out now. The issue features special sections on the election and the housing crisis, with articles from the YIMBY debate, disaster insurance, and tenant organizing, to Andrew Tate, trans medicine, the French left, and much more. The issue includes many Dig favorites, including Gabriel Wynant, Aziz Rana, Wendy Brown, and Sarah Jaffe. Subscribe today to get your copy at dissentmagazine.org/subscribe. You'll get 3 issues per year, as well as digital access to 70 years of archives. That's dissentmagazine.org/subscribe. Let's talk about a relevant case study, one we touched on a bit earlier. Hillside Villa in Chinatown, where the 30-year rent covenant established by LIHTC, I assume, had expired, and the landlord wanted to double the rent. Tenants organized to demand that the city use eminent domain to purchase the property and sell it back to the tenants. And I think really notably here, a really poignant part of the story is that 3 households at Hillside Villa had already been displaced decades ago for the construction of the LA Convention Center. Tell me about that fight and what it reveals about how organized tenant power can approach using and confronting state power.
There was a way of dealing with this kind of shit every time for the last 30 years that I've been living in this neighborhood. And this was the tenant organizations would come to renegotiate a short-term extension and then the relocation of the tenants. And basically, there is this very well-known tenant rights organization that was in the business of negotiating this every year. When one of these buildings was coming to place, they would negotiate an extension and then help people with the relocation and moving on. There was the lawyers, legal aid would help with that. And it was just like a pattern of doing this stuff, every so often this organization jumps in and says, oh, we're organizing the tenants, and then we negotiate their defeat. When the tenant unions is born with people who don't know about this stuff and they don't trust the lawyers and they don't know this stuff, people decided to fight back and said, we're going to resist. Why do we have to move out? Why do we have to get small extensions? Let's buy the building. This only happened because there was a movement of organized tenants and organizers that wanted to invent something new. And I think that's very, very key to understand.
Organizing in Hillside Villa takes place across 3 languages and 3 tenancy regimes, right? This building includes housing covenanted by LIHTC to produce privately owned, publicly subsidized, quote unquote, affordable housing that includes tenants with Section 8 vouchers and market rate tenants, right? So the organizing that's happening in this building, first of all, had to take place across these regimes. And just to describe, right? Like, I think this building really shows us the failures of our housing system and the state to deliver affordability for people who need it, right? That we have the program of Section 8, which are subsidies to landlords, like directly public, our tax money that goes to landlords' profits. We have these privately owned, publicly subsidized, so-called affordable housing, which comes out of the LIHTC system, which is the low-income housing credit tax, which was an addendum to Reagan's famous tax cuts that then was deployed by Clinton through Hope 6 to basically displace and replace the projects with this scheme. And then, like in this building, we also have like market rate housing. And I think that what's so interesting, right, is that, these are tenants who were living in the so-called solutions to the housing crisis and the bipartisan solutions to the housing crisis. And so their organizing really takes place within the failures of that system. And one of the central problems of the affordable housing system is that the covenants that restrict rents expire. And so even though this building was built through a massive public subsidy, the public benefits were temporary. The rents were only low for a limited time. And the, landlord was then able to raise rents and could have collected market rate rents in perpetuity. And these tenants who had lived in Chinatown for, some more than 20 years decided that no, they didn't want to go. And they have been organizing for more than 5 years. And not only have they been organizing against their landlord, right? Like making it clear by showing up at the landlord's door. This is one of the central interventions of the union, right? If eviction is personal for us, and it should be personal for our landlords too, but also by directly targeting the state and creating a crisis for the state about the failures of this affordable housing system. And their refusal to go quietly to accept relocation money has really challenged the affordable housing system in Los Angeles and has put, their demand, which is that the city eminent domain the building, remove the building from the hands of the landlord, has really put that demand on the table.
One thing to also, I think I want to go back to this whole thing, is the right to stay, right? When people were fighting against the displacement from the housing projects, they were fighting for the right to stay. When people are fighting against gentrification, they're fighting for the right to stay. When people are fighting in Hillside Villa, they're fighting for the right to stay. Because again, we want to look back at how long does it take for people to build relationships to land, to institutions, to each other, and so on and so forth. And the non-profit industrial complex and the legal aid defenders and all of these people kind of push that aside for the sake of I don't know what. And here's the tenants union saying, no. People have a right to stay. We're going to fight with you for your right to stay. And not only that, we're going to fight for your permanent right to stay through the expropriation of this land through eminent domain. I just think it's part of the key thing.
I want to pause to address a really basic point your book makes. The way that rent and the landlord-tenant relationship appears under mystified form is as a fair payment from one person for a service provided by another, that service being housing. What does this mystify? How is it that working class people produce homes and also, in producing neighborhoods in the cities that they're a part of, also produce those homes value? Why is the tenant-landlord relationship an expropriative one?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this moment, landlord lobbyists are conspiring to rebrand themselves as housing providers, right? Which really takes this ideology of rent as a fair payment for something that you receive, which is housing, to the kind of extreme. And what this mystifies, right, is the fact that this relationship, this payment is based, one, on our human need to have housing. It is a human need and therefore should be a human right. And in this sense, rent is basically the fine we pay for having a human need. And how do landlords come by this housing that they so generously charge us like the majority of our wages to access, right? They don't come by it because they work for it. No, the average landlord works 4 hours a month. How do they come by it? Well, they or their parents had more money than us, and they used that money to buy up housing, right? To hoard the places where human beings can live. And then they charge us to access that. So like what this ideology mystifies, right, is that rent is also a tribute. And that is also, I think, in so many ways why they're desperate to rid themselves of this title of landlord, which really like makes that power relationship clear, makes rent as a tribute clear. And then I think just like the last thing that I'll say on what this relationship mystifies is like the central role of violence in forcing us to pay this tribute, pay this fine for our human need at the barrel of a gun, right? It's that landlords have a monopoly over state violence. And if we don't pay this tribute, they can call, they have an ownership deed, which is effectively a voucher for state violence. And they can call in that voucher to send agents, armed agents of the state, to eject us by force from our homes if we can't pay the rent. And then if we find ourselves outside, we can be, again, criminalized, jailed, harassed, ticketed, because it is effectively a crime to be homeless. If it's a crime not to have housing, then it is effectively a crime not to be exploited by a landlord. Part of what our goal was in writing this book was about demystifying this relationship that is set up as normal and even natural, right? But of course is anything but. What are landlords capturing with this insane price that they're making us pay for accessing our housing, right? So much of that is our own public resources, right? They're charging us to access the public resources of transportation, the public resources of schools, and they're charging us to access our own labor, like our collective labor in producing the places where we live, right? Like the work that we've done to make our neighborhoods what they are, that then our landlords are expropriating and then charging us to access.
Yeah, and just a little bit of an aside, and this also this kind of thing that we're fighting against when, for example, non-profit community development organizations or corporations move into a neighborhood and say, oh, we need to do more development. Development is about reinforcing this relationship, not now just through landlords, but through larger institutions that are housing people with more money and more resources, but also that are changing the conditions of the neighborhood. But basically, the most of people are being pushed out and displaced, so there can be a different kind of ownership. One of the things that we started seeing in our neighborhood as the gentrification wave was coming is the construction of new apartments that were demolishing rent affordable housing, and we're creating these new rental units where basically people were moving from renting an apartment to renting a bedroom, whole families renting a bedroom. And we have several buildings that were built around here where basically tenants were being warehoused, whole families were warehoused into 8-bedroom buildings with 2 bathrooms and 1 kitchen. So the system of development is also reinforcing this condition and making conditions worse for people, just as an aside in terms of how the system that supposedly develops our communities is also reinforcing this condition.
I think people consider tenant unions to be mostly, maybe exclusively, occupied,
Communist.
mostly communists, sometimes
Sorry.
exclusively
Sorry.
communist.
I'm sorry. Go on.
I think people consider tenant unions to be, as we've touched on before, mostly about an individual building or an individual apartment, disrepair, a leaky sink, lead poisoning, rising rents, things like that. And so, relatedly, building the movement would seem to be about building a union building by building and then across the city to deal with housing issues. But you all tell a story of tenant unions as these really, really capacious vehicles for changing everything: police and collective safety, gender violence, even questions around internationalism, a word that you keep invoking, Leo. And you describe landlordism and tenancy as really this central axis around which American political economy organizes itself. Why are tenant unions such a good organization for the practice of emancipatory politics more generally?
Well, I mean, I think I already said part of that question, right? It's about the reconstruction of citizenship. And to do that, you have to change the relationships people have with each other. In a country where every 4 years we decide who's going to be our president, and it's always a bad guy or well, we haven't had a bad woman yet, but it's always not working out. I think living in Los Angeles, one of the largest cities in the country, in California, which is the fifth economy in the world, that is mostly run by the Democrats, we can see that the alternative is not working anymore. We need to rebuild power. We need to rebuild the state. We need to build relationships, and at least coming from this place, we're saying, where else are you going to organize if it's not with your neighbors right next to each other? Of course, there's lots of places, and we're getting into debates with labor around this stuff. There's lots of places, but this is a place where people are living the conditions of capitalism, the crisis of capitalism. This is the place where people are realizing that people are being pushed out of their neighborhoods, that the democratic values are not producing anything. I mean, the fact that they vote is not producing anything. These are the neighborhoods where transit is not working, where there is no lighting in the streets, where the picking up of the trash is not the way we were supposed to. This is a place where we're realizing that life as we want it to be is not happening, where the American dream is not really happening the way we want it to do. And this is a place where we can talk about these things. So I just personally think that if we're talking about building citizenship, regardless of whether you vote or not vote, regardless of whether you're able to elect the next cool person, we need to build the power, and that power is in those relationships. And the local is the place where you articulate the priorities of the community, the place where you make decisions about the priorities of the community, and the place for which you push for your demands. This is the place where you decide what is necessary within your small geography or the neighborhood. And once you understand the priorities within the own geography of the neighborhood, this is the place for which you can jump to other neighborhoods and start talking about what are the priorities of the local city of the larger neighborhood. We're talking about building democracy. So to me, it's a given that we need to start where people are living and suffering the consequences of failed capitalism. And this is a place where we can start rebuilding our own relationships to build power. And as we build power, to build organizations that change the balance of power. And as build organizations that change the balance of power, to build a different sense of democracy and participation where everybody gets to decide what happens. It's very general, but we're seeing it in our own neighborhoods. We're seeing it in our own communities. As Tracy described, we're seeing it in the stoplights that are being put, in the cleaning of streets. Our communities, for example, the coordination of our part of the district, they coordinate the picking up of trash in the neighborhood. We set the calendar for the council member or where and when they have to pick up the big bulky items in the neighborhood. They come to us and say, okay, where do we need more stoplights this coming years? Stuff like that. But that's not all, right? We need to change to the larger thing. So what are relationships to property? Who decides what happens to the place that we live in? Last year, I brought people slides of the landless workers movement. I started talking about the struggle for land in the community. And the tenants that I was showing these pictures to were saying, that's so funny. They're working for land. They're trying to take over for land to build their own homes and stuff like that. And they said, well, we have it easier. We already live in the homes. We don't have to fight for the land. What we need to do is be able to expropriate the homes so we can stay there. That could only happen because of a history of struggle of people in these buildings and community talking about what they want to do. That could only happen because they all know each other and they feel comfortable in daring to say, these homes belong to us, we need to take them over. And this applies to everything else. So it's about building those relationships where people can rethink the relationship to property, to the state, and to the country.
And maybe to just make that a bit more concrete, like to give two examples. I'll steal yours, Leo, which is, one of the stories that we tell is about the way that the tenant union, the local chapter in the East Side, was able to think through the problem of community safety by inhabiting the space of their alleys, right? And so a member of the local was like the subject of a really violent attack and was hospitalized. And, the way that the union responded to this was, first by really trying to address the problem of the space where it occurred. It happened in these alleys that connected these apartment buildings together and like run throughout the neighborhood. And they recognized these alleys were dark. They were used as basically dumps. They were filled with trash. And so what did people do, right? They got together and they cleaned the space. And over time, right, by doing the work of cleaning the space, then they also changed the meaning of the space. And suddenly there would be social sanctions if you were to be caught dumping stuff in the alleys. And then not only did they clean it, right, they inhabited it. They used it as a place to have, weekend sales, community meetings, and like movie nights for kids. By inhabiting the space, they were able to make a safer space, right? Like that's a really key example for us to think about how a tenant union can, reshape our relationship to safety in our community without deputizing that demand to the outside occupation forces of the police, right? For another example, right, I want to talk about the organizing that's happening in New York against Pinnacle, which is a investment firm that puts up all of its resources towards Israel bonds. And the part of the organizing that's happening, right, is about tenants' living conditions in these buildings in Crown Heights, but also about how their own money is being fed into a genocide, and I think that these examples really make clear, right? Like when we're talking about a tenant union, we're talking about an infrastructure that can put to work some of our resources as tenants, right? What are they? There are bodies that can stay put, that can occupy space. There are rent checks, right? Which are in many cases like connected to these broader social forces and our own displacement and each other, right? Our social relationships, the capacities that we have to socialize risk. And I think that, when we think about those tools, we get a window into how a tenant union can be used not just for the struggle against landlords, but actually as a window into many other struggles in reshaping the terrains of power that shape our lives.
One challenge, and actually I was just thinking about it out loud, is with traditional Marxism, the factory is the place where people organize themselves and a culture is developed, and that from which you can then create this revolutionary subject. Well, here when we're talking about the tenants union or locals, we're actually creating a new culture. A new culture is being created over time. And the organization is the umbrella within which that culture, with different set of values are being developed, right? The question is, how do we do it in a very self-conscious way? The people who live in these neighborhoods from the beginning that have already created a neighborhood with its own set of values, relationships, interests, so on and so forth. And as the common sense of capitalism and renters demand says, okay, yes, you have all this stuff, but you're not entitled to it. We're able to change the conditions, say, no, yeah, actually, we're entitled to it because we created it and we built it. And that gives us then the tools for fighting. And just going back to example of dealing with the gang members, as the members of the community, we're creating these safe spaces in the community. the gang members felt themselves welcome into these places, and the community started seeing the kids as part of their family. In one context, the gang members were saying, "Oh, you cannot have movies here," but eventually they were watching the movies with the community. And then when the community organized a festival around the neighborhood where all these alleys were happening, the police came and said, "You're going to need the police to protect you." And the women said, "Why do we need the police to protect you? To protect us? We already have a relationship with these kids. They're not going to do anything to us," which completely contradicts all the dominant values in the neighborhood. A, you don't need the police, and B, these kids are your neighbors. Imagine that being articulated and grown and being managed in the long run. So I just think this is also a cultural entity that is building new cultures, new values, rebuilding social relationships. And politics flows from that. As you change the social relations, you change the values, and you change the sense of power the community has. So it's very, very important to look at that at the local as a place where this is happening. And that's why we think we need to build these relationships.
Yeah, that's really great. Revolutionary subjects are made, not found, though not under conditions of their own choosing. For workers and renters alike, the strike is the ultimate weapon. For workers, withholding labor; for tenants, rent. It's really powerful, but also very, very risky. How do you organize a tenant union to the point where it can wield the strike weapon? And how do you navigate the giant risk of eviction that's at play? You've mentioned the Los Mariachis de Unión de Vecinos de Boyle Heights. These are tenants in a building who largely work as mariachis, or in substantial part work as mariachis, picking up work at the nearby Boyle Heights famous Mariachi Plaza. And just as an aside to potential readers, this book has lots of great stories like this. How did the mariachis do it, and how have others?
Yeah, so I think, one of the reasons why we love to tell this story also is it really taught us a lot in the union about what was possible and how we can wield this strike power. And this was a building of, as you said, like 26 units, 2 blocks from Mariachi Plaza. A third of the residents are mariachi musicians. Most of the tenants have lived there for over a decade, some over 30 years. And, a new landlord buys the building, throws up a Craigslist ad renaming the building Mariachi Crossing, and sends out rent increase notices, some up to $800 a month, right? And for the tenants who've lived there their whole lives, right, that this is like, these are rent increases that are tantamount to eviction notices because, of course, so many of them can't afford to pay it. And I think that what's so essential about their struggle is that this was a market rate building. So technically, legally, the landlord could charge whatever the as they say, the market, not the tenants, could bear. And so, what avenues did the tenants have access to, right? Like, according to the legal system, none. If they asked their representatives, like, what would they become, right? Just like a sad story in a legislative change that would take place after they were already kicked out. So what did they decide to do? And I think that it's also important to say, right, like, they didn't start with the idea of a rent strike. That emerged through, the process of organizing. The first thing they did as a building was they just wanted to meet their landlord, right? They just wanted to know the person who was going to kick them out of their homes. And of course, what they found was that there are so many systems that protect landlords from us, right? That this building was purchased under an LLC. They didn't even know who it was. So the first thing they did was have to identify him, which involved, one of the organizers' kids knocking on doors with pretending to sell chocolates, that this is the amount of labor that it took to actually reveal the identity of a landlord, to make our problems that are personal for us personal for them, right? And then, they wanted a meeting and the landlord ignored it. So they tried protesting, right? They got so much of community support. They got so much press about their struggle. And still, I think importantly, that too did not work. And they recognized, eventually, like, what is this landlord going to listen to, right? And the answer that they came up with eventually was like the impact on his pockets, their rent checks. And so by organizing to withhold their rent checks, so they went through, a long process organizing to withhold their rent, and not just the tenants that received the rent increases, but also the tenants who could pay or the tenants who hadn't received increases at all yet. And throughout this process, they met every week. They met during Christmas. They had bake sales and parties. The signature of their protests of coming out in the mariachi regalia and playing for the crowd. And I think that, that story that I told of like feeling comfortable, like a tenant going on strike, right? Because she felt comfortable enough to borrow an onion from a neighbor is really important here, right? Over time, they decided to withhold their rent. And they stayed on strike, combining that economic sanction of their landlord with direct actions where they camped out on their landlord's lawn, with the sort of reputational damage that they were able to wield through control, like through getting their message out in the press, with the support and solidarity of the union. And through that process, after almost a year, they got their landlord to the bargaining table, and they signed a collective bargaining agreement that was the equivalent of rent control for their building. I think that one of the key things that this shows us, right, is that like, what were the resources that they relied on, right? That they were relying on the infrastructure of the union to support them in their struggle, and they were relying on their relationships with each other to be able to take that risk. That onion is, to me, like the force that we have as tenants.
That is a really moving story. But what about the risks, or am I overstating those?
Yeah, I think that, one of the things that the association did, right, is arm each other with adequate information. And we do actually have a lot of protections as tenants in taking these risks. And this is one of the instances where the division of labor in our movements to recruit the lawyers into the armchair of our struggle is helpful. And I think that, specifically in this building, because so many of the tenants were undocumented, that was the first concern, right? Is what is going to happen to my immigration status, right? And people reckoned with their rights that, like in California, landlords can't share your immigration status. What else did they learn, right? That were the cops going to throw them out on the street the first night that they didn't pay rent? No, we learned that eviction is a process and only a judge can evict you. And so we learned that those are our rights. I think the other thing that they learned through the process of organizing is that they could share risk. It is true that it is risky to stop paying rent, right? Some of the tenants described that they thought the whole building was going to collapse, right? That's how dramatic it is to take that step. But I think that discovering that when you wake up in the morning and the building is still there and you're still there, and you have the support of your neighbors, it's not only do you realize that you have more power than you thought you did, you have a new kind of power that you never even thought possible. I also think that, in this case, part of the stakes were really about people's long-term relationships to this place, right? And the desire and even the desperation to remain puts tools on the table that maybe you wouldn't have considered before. I think that for all of us, it's a real lesson in the kind of, in what our long-term commitment to a place makes possible, and what taking calculated political risks, what that can win.
And together with that is also the fear question, right? I mean, we're talking about there is the risk and then there's people's fears themselves. And one of the things that we also talk a lot about is that in the fear, there is also the demand, right? The person who's afraid of not paying rent doesn't want to pay rent. The person who's afraid of not paying rent is angry because they have to pay rent. The person who's afraid of not paying rent is terribly angry because the housing conditions are not the quality conditions that they want. And all of those things is how do we change the fear and focus on the anger and the frustration and all these things? And the tenants union is the one who provides that space, is the one that provides the impetus that makes all these things happen. And this is why the tenants union has to come before the lawyers, right? Because the lawyer, on the contrary, is going to appeal to your fear, is going to ask you to negotiate, is going to take you all these places. And we wouldn't say, no. Look at how long have you been living here, how much committed you are, and are you sure that you just want to take that risk? So we want to take people to this other place, and in that other place, they will find all the resources and the network and the support and all the stuff that comes with it. The tenants union provides for that.
Yeah, and I guess, I mean, just to add, to our conversation that we were having about lawyers before, is like one of the terms that I love from that like online real estate network of grifters that's constantly telling you how to live off rents, as one of the one of the YouTubes is called, is this term professional tenant. And, one of the landlords describes it as actually, he says the professional tenant is to landlord as the boogeyman is to children. And I'm like, well, you just said that it doesn't exist. But anyway, they're not that smart, right? That's not why, as I said before, that's not why they get to own our housing. But that term professional tenant, right? It describes someone who knows the law and who is able to wield the law in the service of not paying rent. And I think that is something to popularize and celebrate. And, I think about my own building, which has been on rent strike for 2.5 years. Certainly it was unpleasant and a little scary to get angry text messages from a basic stranger saying that he was going to throw me out of my house, right? But we actually have so much safety, right, in taking that step together, partly because we're relying on the historic wins of the tenant movement in New York City to give us rent stabilization. That is the thing that we're struggling for in this building. I think there is something to celebrating the testing of the limits of the law and of our capacity, and one of the people that we interview in the book, who's organizing in the K3 Tenant Council, right? Talks about himself as a guinea pig. He's going through an eviction process in his building for this tenant association, which is a terrifying experience, right? But he's I'm a guinea pig. We'll know so much more about our landlord's capacities and plans once I go through this process. And so I think that the things that we can have access to, as Leo said, of, transforming our fear into that defiance that's already there, transforming the experience of an eviction into an experiment, transforming a risk into fuck you. I don't want to pay. This is what organizing makes possible.
And at the national level, it's important to understand that there is places where these conditions don't exist. And then, of course, the political struggle is to create the legal conditions for people to be able to resist on a rent strike. Because, I know that this is not the norm across the country. But so we also have to think of a tenants movement that little by little, as creating these conditions in a system that is adverse, because of course the law at the end of the day is going to be on the favor of private property and the owners of that property and so on and so forth. But that's part of the struggle. Different parts of the country, we have to look at that part. So there are spaces where we're able to push on that. We're able to pull those levers and build a larger movement. And there's places where we have to build the conditions so we can do these things. And that's very important also to understand for the larger movement of the tenants across the country.
Tracy, this is a question that I always like to ask tenant organizers, and that tenant organizers don't seem to like answering or just disagree with me on, which is a question about what you see as the differences between organizing a worker in the workplace versus in the home. And Leo, you've touched on this a few times, I think. But the question is, would you agree that tenant organizing, at least under current conditions, is harder than labor organizing? How would you compare the wage relationship of workers to capitalists to the rent relationship between tenants and landlords, and then how the two interact? And it does seem to me that there are some reasons that might not have to do with universal abstract laws of motion of capital or anything like that, but there might be some reasons that it's easier, though by no means easy. We've seen union rates, the rate of unionization, union density in the workplace is plummeting over the last half century of neoliberal counter-revolution. But there's still millions of workers in labor unions, and I don't know what the number is, but many, many fewer, orders of magnitude fewer in tenant unions. So what I dedicate my organizing time to is housing and tenant organizing. So I am in no way devaluing tenant organizing, but my experience and the data suggests to me that it's harder. And I'm curious whether you agree, and if not, or if so, why?
I love this question just because I think it's silly to act like the left is a competition. I think too, like how I'm going to answer it is about the intersections. And, I think one of the things that we describe is that like exploitation at home is a discipline for being exploited at work. And that is its explicit historic function. And as we were talking about earlier, right, the role of homeownership as a tool of the Red Scare, right? Indebted homeowners don't go on strike. And, as you describe, right, like where our bosses park our money is increasingly in our homes. And therefore, and in the same way that the, threat of homelessness persists in keeping people at work, right? That the resources that are hoarded, that are stolen from us at work, that then get put in our housing, right? Like 62% of the world's wealth is held in real estate and 75% of that is in housing, right? So like it's going to take both. And I think for me, what's the most interesting is like ways that we can think about accessing tenant struggle through the labor struggle, right? Like I think as we all have been thinking about the demand for divestment in this age of genocide, right? Like what is our role to split our resources from these systems, right? That same tool is really important for tenant organizing, right? When pension funds are heavily invested in companies and like asset manager landlords, that like people's retirement savings are being used to displace them and their neighbors. And so I think that that tool of divestment is one means by which the labor struggle can speak to the tenant struggle. I think too, like, I think about the site of universities and grad workers organizing around their rent burdens, right? Like in the UC system, and the UC, it has like $4.5 billion invested into Blackstone, and it's one of the largest landlords in California. So like their capacity to address their employer also has the capacity to shape rents for entire communities. And so I think that connecting our struggles, like what is called for at this moment, is not really thinking about either or, but actually thinking about their intersection, right? And like thinking about how the Connecticut Tenant Union came out of a member survey from SEIU, and it is our responsibility to pull any lever that we have, right? And think strategically about what those levers are. I guess I will say, right, there are unique challenges of tenant organizing, right? We talked about the ideology of homeownership. Part of it is the fantasies that we have around the protagonists of organizing and the sexism that informs that, right? And that when we think about the domestic sphere as the domain historically of women, and it's often hasn't been taken seriously as like a revolutionary site. I think it's also, there's like racism that informs an understanding of the protagonist of struggle, right? That like, systems of accumulation by dispossession and the history of the war on tenants that has made tenancy itself racialized. So I think that there's an ideological aspect and there's, the historical. We talked about the Red Scare and I think that the way that it has diminished the political will for state intervention in our housing system, and I think we see that in what people think when we think about a public option for housing versus for healthcare. And I think that the terrain is really shaped by forms of disorganization. We talked about all the the different frameworks. Section 8, affordable housing, market rate, rent stabilization, all of these disorganization techniques. And, this is one of the reasons why I say sometimes that I'm a rat or a roach accelerationist, because they're horrible to have, but they're a really good organizing tool, right? Because if one person has them, then everyone has them. And what's good for organizing is a problem that everyone has. We named the problems of accountability. And I think ultimately, one of the real difficulties is that tenant organizing ultimately poses a challenge to private property itself, right? And that is to claim communal control over the places where we live is to transform private ownership. And that ultimately, I think, is the challenge that we pose and the challenge that we face as organizers.
I think one reason it's harder, and this isn't insurmountable, is that with the collective bargaining system in place for labor, you have a thing that happens where the union delivers increased wages and benefits for workers who then pay dues to a union. And if the union is half decent, they can spend that money on organizing more workers. That is possible to do with tenant organizing, and people like you and the Connecticut Tenants Union are at the forefront of figuring that out. But it really hasn't been established as a widespread model. And I know that important work can be done without staff, but I do think that scaling up tenant unionism to the level that labor unionism is at, let alone the level labor unionism needs to get to, which we're far away from, does require staff. That's my analysis. So I have, I guess, a bit of a financial
that's
I
a big challenge.
I think and I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that is the question of the division of labor, right? And it's how do you, how do we resource ourselves in a way that is respects a division of labor, but also allows us to grow? I'm of two minds about this, right? Because on the one hand, I feel we ask tenants every day to, after their jobs, after taking care of their kids, after taking care of their loved ones, participate in the tenant union, right? So that is a volunteer effort, right? So then I think that there is a reason why the Los Angeles Tenant Union is in many ways gone so far, being an all volunteer organization. It's because we ask of ourselves what we ask of our members. At the same time, I do agree with you that paying people to resource them to think strategically about scale, right? Leo hates this. This is one of our sources of disagreement. But I think it's essential that when we think about deploying those resources, how are we deploying them in a democratic way? And that is really I think that is the task of the moment.
And before I let Leo jump in, I think the democratic way is really important because the most effective labor unions use that dues money to build the labor movement, to hire effective, skilled organizers who are democratically accountable to an engaged membership who can then bring more and more workers into the union. We also see a lot of unions, as Eric Blanc has written about a bunch, sitting on piles and piles of cash that are inexplicably, well, kind of explicably, but truly unfortunately not being used for new organizing. So the democratic accountability is key. I agree.
But it's hard to say what the best use of the funds are. You could say the best use of the funds could be relieving the organizers of pressure to have to do casework, right? And actually that could be a better use of the funds than funding organizers. Or
the biggest problem, I think, there's an ideological problem here, and it has to do with the United States. The notion of the professional organizer is very problematic. The professional organizers, as someone who gets paid to do his or her job to organize people in the union, in the tenants union, the tenants organization, non-profit organization is horrible. Right? A professional organizer is not a militant, committed organizer, and that's the biggest problem. The other question is the context where the organizer works, right? And you guys are raising the whole issue of whether the union is democratic or not. Well, let's take it to another level. Is the union so sold out to the Democrats that they'll do anything to just keep Biden in power and do all these things and they will sacrifice labor? So we need to ask the revolutionary question. I mean, revolutionary organizations and across the world have professionals in the struggle, have soldiers in the struggle that get paid and support to fight the struggle. But there is a mission and a vision of transformation that is driving this thing. And the challenge for us is are we building militant organizations that seek the transformation of society to build something different where the professionals are committed and sold to that thing? So we're not professionals, we don't sell our skills so we can survive, but we produce our skills in the struggle so the struggle continues. And that's the challenge and the question that we have to have. Who is the organizer? What is the purpose of the organizer? And how is the organizer subject to the democratic will of the people that are organized to change a new society? But if you ask that question in the United States, across the tenants union, even within Los Angeles Tenants Union, you may end up with people who want to be professional organizers, professional interpreters, professional lawyers. And those fuckers are going to want to build their organization and they're going to tell the union what to do. And this happens in labor unions also, where the professionals tell the union what is to be done, when in reality, labor wants to go somewhere else. The militant organization, for lack of a better language, the militant revolutionary organization subjects their members to a different kind of discipline, to a different kind of understanding. And within that, the division of labor and all this stuff is for the purpose of the betterment of all of community. The day we get to that place in the United States, because I will dare to say that in other countries, people are further away than we are because of anti-communism, because of the Red Scare, because all sorts of things. Well, the moment we get to that place, it will be easier to have this conversation. But I've been in many places where I have this conversation and people just want to be professional organizers so they can pay rent, so they can support their children, buy their cars, and live their bourgeois life as they help people. And so, I mean, this is a big diss to some of my friends and stuff like that, but I think it's important to take this consideration. Are we building militant organized people or building professional organizers?
Let's close by discussing political education, which is complicated because on the one hand, you don't want to treat people like dummies. In fact, of course, oppressed people have a ton of knowledge about the world that we live in. But you also can't presume that the experience of oppression teaches you the exact nature of the oppression or the right strategies to win liberation. You write, quote, "No one is more capable of recognizing the injustice of rent and the need for the transformation of our housing system than poor and working class tenants. At the same time, the knowledge of injustice is not built into the experience of living through it, nor is the knowledge of how to end that injustice." How do you approach political and popular education in a way that squares that circle? Leo, I've heard you talk about acting into new ways of thinking, which is a nice materialist formulation. How does this fit into the pedagogical practice of the union?
We have to understand the dialectic or the tensions between the two things, right? The political education is about the consolidation and the articulation of the analysis for the given context, right? So the political education is also, it's about the articulation and synthesizing of the knowledge that is developed over time out of this experience. And that's very, very important because a lot of times, as you build a campaign, you develop an understanding of where the campaign has to go, who are the targets, and what is to happen. That's just not born out of nowhere, right? The analysis, the materialization of the analysis, the consolidation analysis gives you the political understanding of what is to be done in a given moment. That's just not going to happen naturally through circulars of popular education, through people just reflecting their own experience on everything. The organization helps to synthesize that stuff. And of course, this exists within a larger context of struggles and history and all that stuff. So in that context, it's important as people develop their own understanding and their own analysis for them to also understand other experiences, other histories, other reflections. So political education brings that into the table, brings the external knowledge, the external analysis, the historical knowledge into the conversation. Popular education is about the development of the subject, the development of the person or the community that understands themselves as actors within a historical process, that understand themselves as the people who ask questions of the surrounding. And as they're asking questions of the surrounding, they develop actions to transform that surrounding, and in that process, they transform themselves. And this doesn't happen without acquiring knowledge from somewhere else. This doesn't happen without learning math so they can calculate how much are they paying in rent and going through a spreadsheet so they have all these things. I have someone expert that can help them process that stuff. Those things are play with each other. What is scary sometimes is when people say, oh, people must understand political education and we're going to dump all this knowledge on them and now they're going to know how to struggle. Well, that's just as bad as saying that people just out of their own experience are going to understand that they're revolutionary subjects. It is a process that is continuous, that is ongoing, that plays off each other, and it's a context and it's something that is being created as the organization, as a learning organization, is building the skills to be able to do this with the community. It's, as an organization, is questioned by its own members in saying, this is not relevant to us, but this is. One example that I have on this thing is like, Unión de Vecinos at some point, our local, was very embedded and involved in environmental justice work. We went to this city where the water would come out like iced tea. And we started organizing the tenants. And basically we said, oh, no, okay, we're going to organize so we can bring the EPA and all these agencies so they study the water. And the tenants were saying, why are we studying the water? What we need to do is take over the water companies. And we're like, no, because if we get these studies and we get the chemical, all this stuff, and it was a big struggle. So we did the studies. We came up with the water was contaminated. And then they say, okay, now what do we do? And I said, well, we have to take over the water companies. The tenants were ahead of us in this process. So we turned the chemical problem into politics, and it came out of the community. But we wanted to educate them about understanding pollution of water and also they knew better than us. So it's creating the politics also with the organization when knowledge and the production of knowledge and the relevance of knowledge is also negotiated between quote unquote the experts. Both experts, the experts in life and the experts in the science. The problem wasn't science, the problem was politics. But the organization had the capability to change its mind and say, you know what, let's take the leadership of the community, let's take the water companies. One synthesizes, the other one is producing the subject that makes these things happen.
I'll just reflect and think about, like what are the spaces that we make in our own unions such that this process can take place, right? Like those are, meetings at the level of our buildings, at the level of our neighborhood, and at the level of our city, right? Like, and thinking about these as spaces of reflection where our work is about this process and allowing this process to take place. And and I think like thinking about the book as a part of this process, right? Like how it is that our unions can archive our struggles such that we can share these strategies, we can refine them, we can grow our movement, we can take more risks such that more people can be involved so that we can transform our institution and ourselves as we transform the world.
What we need to learn to understand is that every space where people come together is a place of learning and the construction of democracy. And the challenge for us is to be able to understand that. So democracy as the construction of the political, everybody gets to participate, everybody gets to reflect, everybody gets to make decisions. At the same time, it's the place where everybody through their actions get to learn what is to be done, get to learn what are we trying to do. And that happens in the small meeting of the tenant association, in the neighborhood meeting of the neighborhood committee, in the local meeting. All the time we're learning and we're building democracy. And all the time we're building the political knowledge that we need to achieve so we take control of things and the social knowledge so we learn how to work together. And that's where popular education and politics go also together. We also have to be self-conscious being, building an organization where the struggle is a school and the school is a struggle.
Beautiful. Tracy Rosenthal and Leonardo Vilchis, thank you both very, very much.
Thanks for having us, Dan.
Thank you very much.
Tracy Rosenthal is a co-founder of the LA Tenants Union and a frequent contributor to the New Republic. They're now on rent strike in New York City. Leonardo Vilchis has been organizing tenants in Boyle Heights for more than 30 years. Trained in liberation theology, he co-founded Unión de Vecinos in 1996 and the LA Tenants Union in 2015. He and Tracy are the co-authors of the book we discussed today, Abolish Rent, out now from Haymarket. I highly recommend you pick it up. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting, the monopoly of property and land is the basis of the monopoly of capital. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also now Instagram at The Dig Radio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or wherever, also leave us a good review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you telling people to check out the pod. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge. And this week, please do consider making a donation to Reclaim Rhode Island.